I'm Eugene Mirabelli, and I didn't realize I was writing science fiction until about a decade ago, when I've written novels for a long time, and they're just ordinary novels. But occasionally, since I worked in the academic, I would write pieces that were called magical realism. But it turned out I could sell those pieces as science fiction and fantasy and make real money, which you certainly couldn't do in the real world. And that's how I happen to be here. So the last, well, we'll talk about it later.
Magic realism is what you say in grant applications because you can't say science fiction fantasy.
There was a, before we get started, I just wanted to point something out because it was noteworthy. Nicola, on the panel you were on last night about reviews, John and Gary both spoke of feeling a desire to be the reviewer who actually understood science fiction and fantasy because there were so many, if the words were something like, people who think that Margaret Atwood invented science fiction and who think that all fantasy has to have swords or else it must be allegory, and the anger was palpable, you know. So it's very apropos of this panel. That panel last night, that there are clearly some of us who are still feeling, who are still gritting our teeth about this. I wanted to ask, we started to write it down, a noteworthy experience you have had or witnessed in which science fiction, fantasy, speculative works or writers actually were disrespected or dismissed by the mainstream, as opposed to one where people claim that it had been
I've never felt any discrimination upon which this panel will touch, which you mentioned at the beginning. But I confess that among my friends, for example, in the academic world, who've read my books, who come to my readings, who buy my books, when I tell them I'm going to a conference, and I mention that it's a conference of speculative fiction, they say, oh, and that's the end of it. If I tell them that I've published a particular piece, I published it in the speculative fantasy and science fiction, they can see in my books, in the regular straight books that I publish, that it'll say at the beginning, parts of this book have been published in the American Poetry Journal, and this, that, and the other, and fantasy and science fiction, Asimov's. They don't make the connection. They don't read my science. To the best of my knowledge, none of the people who read my literary fiction have read any of the fantasy and science fiction, unless it's incorporated into a regular novel, and they seem to just accept it.
I think as long as you don't tell them that it's sci-fi, then it's okay. I actually just had a real-world experience, not so much from the literary world, but just from on a very personal level. And I'll tell you, it stung because I was at my stepdad's funeral, and this old friend of mine who I hadn't seen in literally 20, 30 years, you know, we said, oh, I was so touched that she had come, and then we said the usual, what are you doing, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I said, oh, my husband and I run a small indie press. And then she said, oh, what do you publish? And I said, oh, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, like, still. Like, what do you do? So that was, I was just like, wow, we're just only ever going to do Facebook posts. Okay.
It's hard to know where to begin. Believe me, there's an example of burning a hole right through my head. I have felt in complete contradiction with myself for a long time, having to do the way I've been seen. I certainly have no problems calling myself a horror writer, being one when I started out, and that all worked out really well, and I was completely pleased with it. I didn't mind the fact that it was the bottom of the barrel, because you could do anything you wanted to. And you could make stuff up and change things, and it was all that was very enjoyable and very satisfactory in other ways too. I sort of felt that I changed ground a little bit. The last time I published a novel, it was far too long ago, but because I've been working on something for a long time since. There was a novel called A Dark Matter, and it was reviewed in the Washington Post. I've been reviewed in the Washington Post for a long time, every book. When Michael Gurley was the editor and had influence there, I got friendly reviewers like Liz and some others who knew my work, understood it, and liked it. So I always came out very, very well from the Post. And I kind of expected the same. This novel of mine was assigned to a woman named Marriott, who's a big deal. I think she's the book editor for NPR. So I thought, well, if this works, this is going to be wonderful. And it worked for about 2 paragraphs. Maureen Corrigan was pleased by the quality of the prose that she found in my book, and she was quite interested by developments in the first couple of chapters. And then she came across a hideous fact. She said, but then I discovered that there's something supernatural in this book, which meant that it was junk. And frankly, from that point on, I just disliked it all the way through. Oh my God, that's really it's insensitive. It's bad reading. It's kind of rote learned responses. I know why she felt that way, but it did seem to me that it was a classic case of having a genre label using dismiss my work, which I think after that point she did not really at all with an open mind. So I've never ever forgotten that. And I was going to write. First off, I was going to write for the Washington Post. I thought, no, that's really a bad idea. and then I was going to write a long thing and put it online. And my agent said, that's probably not all that good idea. Because Corrigan has a lot of friends, and there's no reason to, upset things anywhere when they are upset. So I didn't respond to anyone on that, but I still think it was hugely unfair.
Last year, I had my first award nomination. And my wife, very proud, and is also a gender and women's studies professor in Rhode Island, and knows a lot of academics in Rhode Island, spoke to one of her friends who teaches creative writing at the University of Rhode Island. And she said, very excited, that my husband has been nominated for Nebula. He said, genre fiction is fun. Sort of cool. Yes.
Oh, yeah. 1994, I was at what's called Outright, which was a queer book expo. And it was like a PEA for queer fiction. And there I was, and it was the last day, and I was trying to give away a copy of Mark of Slow River. And I went up to someone else. Slow River, sci-fi. I don't read that kind of thing. I said, well, actually, it's science fiction. But fair enough, I'll go find something. And so I went to the next person. She said, oh, you wrote Anime. I loved Anime. And then she looked at Slow River and said, oh, it's sci-fi. I said, well, Anime is science fiction. Oh, no, it wasn't. Spaceship on the why do you think it's not science fiction? Well, I really liked it. Yeah. It was good. Therefore, it's not science fiction. And I was just, it was the first time I had run into that kind of absolute non sequitur. I could not bridge that gap. She just wouldn't listen to me saying, well, Slow River is actually the very near future, so it's much more like
and it's full of twist, and you will like it. It's exciting, it's good, but you know, it's science fiction. I don't read that kind of thing.
Well, isn't it interesting that, I mean, this is a phenomenon I'm sure all familiar with, at least in academia, I'm very familiar with, that works of science fiction that are recognized as literary and having cultural value, works like 1984, Brave New World, The Handmaid's Tale, are invariably described as not being science fiction.
Yeah.
You know, even though they are. So this actually brings up the topic that I know we all do want to talk about, which is the extent to which genre boundaries exist any longer, to the extent that the science fiction, fantasy, horror really are distinct from mainstream or literary fiction, or if that is a completely obsolete fiction.
It's not obsolete, it's still absolutely there, I think. It's just that it sells more and it gets much more media attention now. That films, science fiction films and TV is done so well. I think it's being reflected on the literary world. And now Mark Twain actually uses the word science fiction. Here, now. And I was really struck by, I don't know if you've read it, it's a collection by John Friedman where he interviewed a whole bunch of novelists. How to write a novel, not how to write a novel. I actually read this book. But I did this Q&A with him, and we just talked. And I read this collection, and in it, well, maybe half a dozen people who I know have written what I would call science fiction. No one mentioned the word. And then Doris Lessing, happily talked about science fiction. I thought, well, she's won the fucking Nobel. Why don't any of you? There's nothing wrong with it. But it's just like today, crime fiction is always labeled crime fiction. It's very well regarded, but it's still high dominant. And science fiction is the same. It's beginning to be okay. It's more separate from the way, you know, which I find delicious, obviously, but it's definitely still separate. It's still there are many people I think who are still. I can tell more horror stories. I would say.
Oh my God. In the past 4 or 5 years. There have been an astonishing number of dystopian near-future novels published, literary novels. There's one named Nicola wrote a novel called California. A woman named Emily St. John Mandel wrote Station 11. And there have been a whole lot more. What all these books have in common is that, first of all, the word science fiction was never ever used in the publisher's description, and those words never passed the lips of any of the authors, except to say, well, of course, it's not science fiction. Whereas, by definition, it has to be science fiction. You can't call a dystopian near-future book anything but science fiction. By definition. Allegorical. Probably.
But the thing is, it was such bad science fiction.
But that's the other thing. They're pretty rotten. Just to sneak in another win before I get to where I want to go.
We are operating under what we're calling the Griffith guideline.
Yes.
So we all get one free win. One free win.
So this is half a win. So I'm allowing myself one and a half. I know Nicola, and I know this delightful young guy who interviewed her for an online thing. And the tricky question of genre came up. It was not breathed by Nicola, but by Ruman, the guy who was interviewing. And he said, well, you know, your book could, in kind of a loose associative way, be considered a kind of a genre book. But I don't think of it that way, and I'm sure you don't. She said, oh, no, of course I don't. And he said, because there is a feeling of racism there is a feeling that really genre is ... for stupid people. And I thought, I know that guy. Genre for stupid people. Now that's the most naked expression of a kind of brute, unconscious power that I've ever heard. It's very disturbing, and I can't help but get a little angry at such a blanket, unreflective dismissal of so much. And I've been also this nice chap, Romanos, has read a lot of genre novels, and they actually like it. Where I want to go, however, is the question of the matter that I think the distinction between literary fiction and genre fiction is a very complex affair. There are genre writers and genre novels that are really happy to obey the rules and definitions and boundaries of those genres. There are crime writers who are happily rehearsing the steps made by Chandler and Hammett. Their heroes are in Indiana or Cleveland or in the suburbs of London. They have eccentric, brilliant partners, and they solve mysteries that have a faintly clockwork tinge. That's because that's what they really want to do. And if you're in the mood, that is really satisfying. There are the simple execution of genre steps can be really satisfying. It's like having a warm drink at bedtime, It's like cookies. It feels good, and that's why these books sell, because people like the way they taste. Now, it's not obviously it isn't the only thing you can do with that kind of material. And I want to think, over time, I finally evolved into this position that a book can belong in many ways to any one of these genres and still be literature and should not be thought of as being different in any way from the latest novel by Martin, say, because although it uses some of the definitions and internal structures of genre, I don't want to say transcends, but it uses those things so beautifully and does other things besides that it's full of surprise, full of beauty. A long time ago, I said to myself, a sentiment which I was very pleased that I'm now going to repeat, that to say that a book transcends its genre, like saying of some African American that he transcends his race. It's exactly that offensive.
Maybe you're on the jack of it. So, Sandra, is that what this?
Yes, of course, but I also, the way I think about them largely is, what that primarily affects me as, I think, a publisher, for example, is that it is a marketing construct. It is a marketing construct to sell books. And I always try to remember that, of course, at one point, many centuries ago, this thing called the novel was called unfashionable and low class and this sort of thing, and we can't have that. And, well, now look at us. So I assume that at some point, all of us at fantasy and horror is just going to transcend all those boundaries and no one will care anymore, and won't that be nice? But I don't know if this is still true, but I know that maybe 15, 20 years ago it was that, in fact, writers who wrote sort of in that sort of gray area between literary and what is classically thought of as genre fiction, did much better. Like writers like Jonathan Carroll, for example, who you can find in literature, or fantasy, or sci-fi, because some books are, of course, separate out sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. And you can find him anywhere. and you find him next to Lewis Carroll, you know, and then, but then you find him next to somebody else who's doing science fiction. He writes science fiction, I can't do it right now. But in Europe, he did much better because they were much less concerned about labeling things. And I don't know, is that just a North American thing that we must have little pigeonholes which to put things or else everything makes us nervous?
Well, since you bring that up, you know, we were going to talk about this difference between...
I jumped shots.
Well, you've got up on that anyway. We were going to talk about whether the rigidity of the lines that we see or the attitudes that we see are peculiarly U.S., peculiarly North American, peculiarly English language, and since like the experience in Canada.
Yeah. I'm American by citizenship, but I've lived in Canada for over 35 years now. And you know what Canadians are like. Like we're in this weird, because we're an indie press, we do a lot of things with the so-called literary presses. And, you know, we get some flack of like,
oh, cheesy, you know, we like to do things differently.
And we get things like that, which is always fun. But what I have found that where we do well is that we, publishing genre fiction, we have these unfashionable things called spots in our books. And you know, the literary people really don't like that. But I think we've certainly made the leaps because we are getting reviewed in mainstream press and so on, and they're not necessarily reviewing our books. It's not necessarily genre people who are reviewing our books. Although you do get that whole, like, despite being a horror novel, is it still worth, you know, I'm getting too many ranges in that, sorry. I'm sort of babbling and off track, but I haven't been in a European bookstore in a very, very long time, so I can't say what it's like now. The British bookstores I have been in over the last few years, you do have those sections. I don't know if they're as concerned with it as we are. I do know in Estonia, sci-fi is big. But again, I don't know what the sales figures and things like that are and how well we do. We sell primarily in North America, so we are sort of hamstrung by its constructs.
And again, to bring me to the Estonian sales figures.
I know. I'll get a little button. Big in Estonia.
Well, I think the definition, I think genres are very, very useful. They may be useful for marketing, as you say, but I think they're useful for readers. Some readers go into a bookstore and they want to read a mystery story. If that's what they have in mind, and they can go to a section of the bookstore and find mysteries. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't see any reason why we should complain about that. I certainly have no complaints about it. And the same thing is true of science fiction. Some people want rocket ships or whatever, fantasy, and they know where to go to find that. I must confess that I see the chief difference between one book and another is whether or not it's a good book. It's simply interesting and well written, fine. It doesn't really matter what so-called genre is. But I think it's naive not to recognize that a lot of genre fiction isn't very special. Let me put it this way, it's less good than other books. I'm not saying anybody with a panel here, I'm going to try and insult you.
It can be said about mainstream fiction.
Sure, it can be said about mainstream fiction. Of course it can. And that's the difference between them. But you can call Crime and Punishment a mystery story or detective fiction if you want to. But there's so much difference between a certain kind of genre fiction, which manipulates certain tropes and satisfies the expectations of a certain large group of readers that are interested in that. And another kind of fiction, which can be mystery or detective fiction, in which every page is so much, that's so richer, so much more complicated, in which the story is going in so much different direction, so much more layered, that naturally you say it's a different kind of book. And it is a different kind of book. It's a good book, it's exactly a good book.
Well, someone else has gone all the way out of the way like one too. I actually don't believe in genre boundaries at all. I think that they are completely illusory. At least from the standpoint of the writer. I think what we have are traditions. And we have a lot more conditions than we have here. It reaches a certain kind of narrative, it reaches a certain kind of plot, it reaches a certain kind of theme, it reaches a certain kind of character relationship, and absolutely there are novels and plays and stories that respond to those individual conditions. At the moment where it seems to me, where you try grouping clumps of those conditions into a group and saying, okay, this is my identified it belongs on the shelf, you're just inviting someone the opportunity to cross the line and say, but she was talking about international relations, and you brought it up earlier.
Yeah, it's in England. I can't speak. I haven't been stuff in say Ireland for a really long time. So I'm just going to focus on the UK. That's what I know. I'm a dual citizen, so I've spent a lot of time here and a lot of time. Publishing in the UK is in free fall, and now free out. And bookshops they're not doing very well, and they have done huge discounting, and they are falling back on the bluntest tools. And so you get 2 for 1, and you get, this is sci-fi, this is horror, I mean, with the bluntest pictures on it. Children in peril, okay, there's a bicycle and a little helmet. You don't come across, I have not seen books that just, this is a good book. It's like, this is a literary book you will get with wine, with friends, and talk about, because it has literary things. This is horror, it is not, it's a, honestly, the UK used to be different because of size. I think this country was huge, and they sold a lot of books, and so it was useful for the market to hide off into small books. You didn't have to look so hard. It's like, oh yeah, I know roughly what kind of stuff I'm going to get. Point to that. In the UK, you could wrap your head much more easily around everything, and so you could just look for a good book, whether or not it would involve 6 shooters or spaceships or murder mysteries, or you just.
That's an anthology we should do, 6 shooters and spaceships. I would totally buy that.
I can fight that for the
Yeah.
No, it's been a horrible disappointment to me to go back to England so many times and see this rigidity, this freezing of the barriers between the genres. Because I think that's what, if you look at it purely as a tool for reading selection, I think genre absolutely exists. And it exists for the writer in terms of how you want to be received, how it will be reviewed, about whom, and how they will approach it. I am so tired of thinking that I'm an LGBT sci-fi writer. I'm all of them. I think that's a really good trick. It's like, ta-da, I'm a magician. And so, this is my image, my feeling.
Okay.
Chicago Tribune reviewed it. The reviewer loved the book, but he loved it in such insulting terms. Woo, medievally wenchesy, and yay, and fights, and I was like, this is not what the book is about. He's like, people say, this is not book of age, this is good old-fashioned fantasy. And I'm thinking, there is not a single fantastic thing in it, except how I want to read it with that levering of the mind, a sense of wonder, that sense of magic. But the only magic really is human magic and natural nature. No spells in the magic. But it is fantastic because it requires a certain level of self.
So, getting to the chip on the shoulder part of the panel, I guess I want to ask the extent to which we see science fiction, fantasy, horror writers and fans who are vocally allergic to literary, or what they would call literary work. Let's start with Sandra.
Well, we get that. That's the other side of the coin. Like I said, coming from the poetry world, poetry, and I always get the he's sort of the Danny and faint face. You know, I really hate poetry, but I like yours. So I'm always like, thank you. But yeah, there are a lot of, I mean, we get, again, for cheesing, we get some clock with us like, oh, you guys have that literary genre stuff. It's not as good as the Captain Titanx and the spaceship that you're looking for. So I don't know, I mean, I feel like, it does sometimes feel like you're just being, you know, slapped from all directions by some enormous and terrible squid. That was a weird place to go. Yeah. Like I said, I believe in the doctrine of the good book, you know, like, what does it matter what it is and what we're really doing with it as long as it's an enjoyable read and it's well done.
I guess I'm asking more like, well, you can't answer it though. I mean, you did answer it. So, it's more of a sociological question, you know, about our community as a culture. You know, I mean, one can speak of certain small, isolated groups who are very, very vocal about this, like in literary work. I'm not going to name them here because we all know what I'm talking about. But it's more widespread than that. I mean, there are, it seems to me, I mean, there are people who, well, why would you even write literary science fiction? Why would you waste your time? You know.
Well, one of the curious things is that life is very strange. At least I believe it is. And it's very beautiful and it's unimaginably cruel. And there are some things which realism simply is inadequate for. And so I introduced occasional fantastic elements into my books, which are called literary fiction, because that's the only way that I can capture what I think of as reality. I had one story in which an angel appears, comes down and lands on somebody's skylight and eventually takes her in. She's a real angel. That particular chapter wound up in fantasy and science fiction, but it was part of a literary, college novel. I think there are reasons for it. Those are my reasons for doing it. Have I wondered, what was your question?
All right. I was asking about, you know, sociologically, within the community, because of this whole genre slash chip on the shoulder thing.
I have no chip on my shoulder, believe me.
Not you.
I have nothing to complain about. I'm very fortunate. I remember a comic strip many years ago, Bloom County it was called.
Yes, Bloom County.
It had a character in there who was a Vietnam veteran in a wheelchair. But it also had a penguin. And I was fascinated by the fact that I wasn't bothered by that. It just worked. And I thought, my God, we can do anything. Get away with it.
So it's okay if it's in satire, I guess, or something. I mean, I was on a panel on